These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. Now, up until this point, our story for Assyria has been a tale of conquest. Lots of places have been conquered, many more than once. The kings have told us about where they went to conquer, how brutally they oppressed their victims, and how much plunder they carted away. The kings have told us why they conquered, mostly for the glory of king and god, but only very rarely and in passing remarks have they told us how all this conquest actually occurred on a ground level scale. Now, the best treatments for the Assyrian army in this period are fairly thin and rely more heavily on artwork, though there is little enough of that to work with as well. We have scattered reliefs of individual figures, including some chariot warriors, but our best source comes from the temple of Imgur-Enlil, which Ashurnasirpal will work on later in his reign, and his son will enhance. 3 massive gates get constructed in this temple, each banded with thick bronze bands. Now, these bands were engraved with military scenes, with hunting scenes, and tribute scenes as well, and their detail gives us more information than we've had in a long time about what a Mesopotamian army looks like. And aside from those gates, we have basically not a lot. Scattered bits of art, occasional references, inferences from the campaign accounts that rarely mention the troops with more specificity than calling them infantry and chariots. But taking the reins from Ashurdan through to Ashurnasirpal and his son Shalmaneser III all together, and even until the death of Ashurnirari a century later in some cases, we can kind of put together a picture of the army to a certain extent in this early period. And it's important that we do, because we're currently situated between 2 pretty major military reforms. The first is coming up in a century or so. That's the really famous one. It's going to be enacted by Tiglath-Pileser III in his earth-shaking reforms for the empire in and around 745 BCE. So we want a good foundation for what came before to understand what comes after. But also, this is the first and only military that we have a good handle on since the Bronze Age collapse. And that was a time of massive shifts in how warfare was conducted. So for the Assyrians, our story very much starts with the professional soldier. As we've mentioned, it's very rare in ancient history up to this point for a settled nation to have a class of professional soldiers. Now, the nomadic peoples often operated as mercenaries and bandits in a full-time kind of way, but this could be accommodated by their very different lifestyle. And the larger states have had bodyguard corps or professional troops of some kind, but these were limited in number and only kept while the empire is at power. The Assyrian professional army has, by the time of Ashurnasirpal, existed in some form or another since the late Bronze Age. But in the last generation, it has fully grown and matured into a force capable of operating independently in multiple capacities. Now, the professional army begins with a young man. Now, this young man has something going for him in his life. We don't know all the qualifications, but it seems that entering the professional military was not a career path for the lower classes in general. You needed to be decently well off to get started. It is possible that a regular man serving as part of a mass call-out in a large campaign could perhaps have distinguished himself as a militiaman and been invited into the professional corps, but as reasonable and plausible as this sounds, we don't have evidence that it ever actually happened. Of course, we don't have evidence that it didn't happen either. Our evidence base is frankly pretty thin on who exactly these soldiers were before becoming soldiers. But it does seem that a good many came from decent families. Each professional soldier is, in theory, appointed by the king, though we imagine that most were nominated by officers and then just mass approved by the king. We don't assume he knew every one of the thousands of men under his command, with only the top positions actually being appointed with the king's full knowledge and authority. But it is important that the young man be appointed by the king, because alongside this service appointment, he would receive from the king his service field. The service field is an extension of that Ilkham system that we saw getting started way back in Hammurabi's day, though by now Ilkham has become an absolute mess of related taxation strategies. But at its heart, the deal here is pretty simple. This young man will serve in the army in some selected capacity. In exchange, and for as long as he continues to serve, he will be the owner of a certain plot of land. Plots of about 100 acres were very common. We do see some 50-acre plots. Then for the elite officials, we see more extravagant service field donations. But that 100-acre plot would see the young man basically set for life. He wouldn't work that plot of land, but he is the owner of that land, and that land is totally exempt from all taxes. Therefore, he can rent that land out to regular peasants, which they will work in the same way as they would work any other plot of land, but instead of paying tenancy rents and taxes to the king or to the priests or to the whichever god they're devoted to, they will pay more or less the same amount just to the young man directly. Sometimes the landowner would direct the tenants to plant certain types of crops. Sometimes he would fund certain sorts of improvements, and other times he would be almost totally absent except on collection day. The specifics seem like they were extremely variable from person to person. There's no good way to generalize, but at some point we will look at the wide variety of options that we have records for in later periods. Diversity aside, the economics of this are actually pretty solid. A 100-acre plot of grain can feed about 20 people, but doesn't actually require the work of 20 people to manage. 2 to 4 tenant families can support one soldier's family, especially as the soldier's wife will likely have an occupation supporting the family, such as weaving or brewing, and the soldier himself will likely have other forms of income as well. If the land isn't used for grain, or it's planted with a variety of crops, then the exact calculus on the returns to that land changes, but the service field alone appears to have been enough to keep a standard soldier supplied and paid and happy during most low-intensity periods. This means that when an empire wasn't at war, or when the particular soldier wasn't being called out, because the empire was usually at war, but not everyone was on every campaign. They seem to have had rotational systems even within the professional service. But when he's not on rotation, he didn't need to get paid. He's already getting income from that land. And when the soldier was called out for service, he still wasn't actually paid by the government. He's just supplied with daily rations on a similar level, though slightly better, than an average conscript or laborer working for the government. Now, the economics here are fascinating, and it's hard not to get pulled in, but basically, the Assyrian Empire didn't rely on regular taxation income the way that nearly every government that we think of does. It paid its people in land, and special projects were financed through plunder. That doesn't mean there wasn't a taxation system, but it was a lot thinner and more chaotic than you would expect. Anyway, we're not going to get into the whole taxation thing today. Assyrian economics will come up later, but we'll get off track if we focus on that today. Anyway, The young man is well off when entering the army because he's responsible for purchasing most of his equipment. And since the Assyrian professional soldier is perhaps the most well-equipped soldier east of Greece at this era, that means he has a lot to purchase. The standard equipment for all Assyrian soldiers is spear, bow, arrows, sword, and metal helmet, all of which could be either bronze or iron at this point. Iron only slowly coming to dominate here as the economics of it get better and better. The quality of the weapons would probably be a bit higher for a professional soldier than a militiaman, but honestly, a pointy stick is, at some point, functionally equivalent to most other similarly sized pointy sticks. The real mark of differentiation, and the expensive part, is that a professional in this era would have to buy a full set of lamellar armor, covering the entire torso down to the feet. Importantly, it seems that in at least some cases, the militia may have had bows, shields, helmets, and spears provided to them at no cost by the state, but while that's well attested in later periods, it's quite unclear in this early era and may not yet be the case. Now, something I didn't actually know until reading about Assyrian armor is that what they had was not the same as scale mail. And I think I did call it scale mail back in one of the Bronze Age episodes, so oops for that. But there's an interesting distinction here. Lamellar armor is made up of plates, each plate being a few inches long and either square or rectangular. In the Assyrian case, most plates are about 2 inches long and half an inch wide, give or take a bit. On the top and bottom of each little plate are holes, which are tied with string or leather to the plates above, below, and beside that plate. In a sense, it's sort of like chainmail, but with plates instead of chains, and has very similar properties in terms of stab resistance, doing a bit less to block blunt force, but if the plates are well constructed, may have been rather more stab resistant than chainmail. The weakness here is slashing damage, which can potentially sever the cords connecting the pieces, and also there are gaps in the armor that can be exploited. But the construction of the armor, in at least some cases, seems to have been such that at least parts of the cords would have been concealed under the plates, and thus making the armor rather more durable. To clarify here, the contrast with scale mail is that while scale mail is also made up of small overlapping plates, in scale the individual plates are attached to a leather or cloth backing, not to each other. Though the visual appearance here would be quite similar if you weren't focused on the details, this actually has pretty significant implications for strength and ease of manufacture. Specifically, scale mail is easier to make and it's more flexible to wear, but it's heavier and it's less resistant to blunt damage. The plate ties on lamellar armor require more regular maintenance, retying and loosening or tightening these loose and damaged ties that would just happen just by wearing it regularly. But it is apparently easier to replace a moderate sized section of lamellar armor, while scale mail comes pretty much as a unit. And that's just a fun fact for fans of armor types that I learned. Maybe you already knew that. I thought it was cool. Anyway, the point is that this lamellar armor would have been crazy expensive. The plates themselves would have been made of iron or bronze. Some suits seem to have had a mix of both, and sometimes an individual plate would just be replaced with whatever metal was available. But in either case, it's perhaps 25 to 50 pounds of metal in an era where each chunk of ore was painstakingly processed with nothing but manual tools and primitive, inconsistent furnaces. This is the basis for why all professional soldiers in Assyria were decently well funded. You could be a professional soldier if you came from a decent family who could provide armor for you, and hence also provide a level of physical and cultural training for you before you actually joined. Alternatively, and this is more of a hypothetical that we expect would happen but don't have any proof would happen, if you were a militia fighter who managed to do well during a conquest and you received enough plunder and prestige, perhaps you could get invited into the royal corps. It would make sense. Again, we don't know that it happened. Seems like a thing. Anyway, this armor would, it seems, mostly have been worn for sieges, potentially also for the more static sort of large battles. But for skirmishes, raids, and the most open of battles, it seems that it would have been left behind in the camp in order to preserve the soldiers' mobility. Still, in a siege context, this armor would have been extremely strong, allowing for a powerful advance against the relatively weak missiles sent down by most entrenched enemies. And in many cases in this early period, it seems that siege engines were often not even required to assault many towns. A column of armored professionals was enough to advance and raise ladders or tear with axes through the weak points of the ancient walls and gates. The armor wasn't unbeatable in a theoretical sense, but against the opponents and threats most often faced by Assyria, it seems to have been a strong, hard counter, and the core of the early Assyrian military strength in a technological sense. We see this heavy defensive focus as well with the emphasis on the power of the Assyrian shield. Now, technologically, the shield wasn't much. The standard version provided, we think, by the state to every warrior, professional and militia, was a woven wicker rectangle made from stiffened reeds and hung on a simple wooden frame, large enough to cover head and torso, enough to slow an arrow or tangle up an enemy's spear, but something that likely wouldn't survive a heavy engagement, probably requiring replacement after each battle if it saw any significant use. The wealthy could replace this shield with a round bronze shield, which would be a bit smaller but more durable, and the king and top nobles seem to have had quite elaborate shields. Ashurnasirpal is seen in one piece of art being protected by a spiked shield, though whether the spikes are for decoration or for sadism is not made clear from the sources. Since he's only ever portrayed in the art as a chariot fighter, the spiked shield would never have been in a position to be used offensively in battle. Though he does claim to have fought on foot in the written sources, perhaps he could have spiked some people then. Now, every wing of the army used shields, but unlike our usual image of the warrior who carries sword in one hand and shield in the other, shields were, in the art, almost always held by a separate soldier. Often it seems some among the spearmen were selected for the battle or would opt based on circumstance to act as shield bearers for other members of the army. And this led to a tactic that I don't think is seen anywhere else in history, that of the archery wing being used as an assault division. Now, typically we think of archers either withdrawing when the enemy gets too close or pulling out sidearms to engage when battle is joined. But for the Assyrian archers, because they had a rank of shield bearers in front of them, armed with sword or spear at their front, they could withstand all but the heaviest of charges and continue to fire arrows into the enemy line even when the enemy line had engaged with the archers themselves, rather like a phalanx with the spears replaced by arrows, giving a standoff distance that the enemy would struggle to push through. And the heavy armor meant that even if the shield wall was penetrated by the enemy, the archers were well enough defended not to overly fear enemy weapons. And at this point, they could go for their own swords until the line had been reformed. But the end result is an extremely heavy line of missile troops, which would have been extremely hard to shift at long range, and then terrifying as they approached among an unceasing volley of missile fire, and strong enough to just press against and break lines of dedicated infantry. The professional infantry body could also act on its own to devastating effect, but could also act as the hard core amidst a more lightly armed but similarly effective body of conscript militia. Now, we call them conscripts because they were torn from their families at government order for months at a time as part of their expected taxation service. But among the Assyrian communities, we don't hear much about any resistance to this long-established practice, with by now thousands of years of pedigree behind it. The equipment of the militia was essentially identical to the professional soldiers, aside from the body armor. The weapons were state-provided, but the individual conscript was welcome to bring his own equipment. It's generally believed that the quality of state weapons in the eras where they were available, mostly later on, were serviceable, perhaps they were even good, but we still do see individuals purchasing their own weapons when they can afford it. So the state armories were not the most premium. Lacking body armor, the regular troops seem to have worn basically just their normal tunics, often with decorated fringes, as they would in daily life. Some have suggested a form of cloth or leather armor for the militia, but this seems poorly supported, and most likely the only personal protection was the wicker shield and the pointed Assyrian helmet. The main protection for the regular troops was almost certainly the strength of the Assyrian formation as a whole, the shield wall protecting lines of spearmen and archers, and the various moving parts pressuring the enemy in ways that they typically couldn't react to without more advanced tactics or overwhelming numbers. And in the early Assyrian period, it seems that the best troop protection happened long before the battle even started, with the kings of this era seemingly able to ensure that for any war that they started, they brought the appropriate amount of troops and supplies to the fight to prevent the Assyrian army from ever being in a vulnerable position. Strategy is a stronger shield than iron, and knowing how to declare the right war at the right time, moving the proper logistics to the proper places, is hard to quantify, but it is a weapon more important than all the spears and arrows of the soldiers themselves. In an earlier generation of modern scholarship, the Assyrians were often compared to the Germans of the world wars, but at least the early Neo-Assyrian kings always had the advantage of knowing not to declare wars against enemies that could overwhelm them. That is to say, when evaluating the performance of an army, we shouldn't take the state of a war as a given. Picking when and how to fight is often more important than the fight itself for deciding victory. And all that extends all the way from the selection of the individual battlefield up to picking which wars to start and end. Now, all this has been a discussion of infantry, and while that seems to have been the most actually important branch of the Assyrian military, certainly the most prestigious were the chariots. Important to note here that the Iron Age chariot appears in most respects to be an improvement over the many designs of the chariot common in the late Bronze Age. However, while the chariot unquestionably dominated the battlefield in the late Bronze Age, it seems that changes in tactics and equipment among the infantry have relegated it now pretty strongly to a support role. Not that it wasn't still a powerful force on the right battlefield, it absolutely was, but it no longer seems to be decisive in the way that it was in the Late Bronze Age. The Iron Age Assyrian chariot is two horses attached to a small two-wheeled wagon with covered walls that come up to about hip level. The attachment between horse and chariot is actually now a mechanism of multiple curved poles, which would act as shock absorbers to smooth the ride and allow faster and smoother battlefield movement, as well as making the chariot as a whole more durable, even though the total weight of wood was probably less than the previous attachment system had been. That's the sort of technological change that we can see just from the art compared to the older periods, but there were clearly a lot of really small refinements to the chariot as a weapon system that have occurred over the centuries. But it's kind of a little bit too late at this point because the chariot as a whole is on its way out. Decorations were common both on the horse and the chariot, though at this point in history only the front neck and chest of the horses were armored to save on weight. Also the riders would of course have been armored, but the chariot as a whole no longer seems to carry the scale mail, and in this case it is scale mail because it's attached to the backer board. Doesn't seem to have that scale mail that it had in the Late Bronze Age. Much more lightweight, less heavily defended because it's not getting as close to the action. Within the chariot were two, sometimes three, riders. The main charioteer carried a bow and would fire arrows throughout the battle. This main man would have been a figure of great social importance and usually, of course, great wealth. He was assisted by a driver, who would also have been skilled but of lower social status. Sometimes there's also a shield bearer in the chariot as well to protect the other two occupants and toss javelins, but this third man seems to have been optional. The only known tactics for early Iron Age chariots are to function as flanking skirmishers, going around the main army and potentially through gaps and firing arrows at the sides and rear of a force, a task which in some scenarios could have been exactly the sort of shock that would be needed to shatter an enemy, but in many other scenarios would have been of limited use. Still, despite the reduction in battlefield significance, the chariot retained a lot of the prestige it had built up in the Bronze Age, and the king and his nobles loved to be seen atop them, even if their campaign narratives not infrequently mention kings fighting on foot, especially in rough terrain or perhaps in sieges as well. So chariots are expensive and prestigious, and they are still useful in many cases. But in these early Neo-Assyrian centuries, they are slowly getting replaced by a new branch of the military, the nascent cavalry. And I really can't stress enough just how nascent the cavalry are here. We won't see them for sure in a battle until Shalmaneser III, but they definitely exist in Ashurnasirpal's army, and almost certainly are being experimented with before that. And cavalry are almost certainly not an Assyrian invention, just a thing which is in the air in this era, as horses are slowly being bred large enough to take the weight of an armed rider. Now, cavalry in this area is used exactly like chariotry. And I mean that more literally than you realize. Every bit of our very sparse evidence indicates that cavalry was deployed in teams of two. On one horse was an archer, dressed in similar ways to the main charioteers of the chariot teams. Indeed, they may have been main charioteers, just not currently on a chariot. On the other horse is a driver who holds the reins of both horses, driving the two of them together across a battlefield as if they were still in a chariot. Writing skill was very poor for both of them. Art of this early period shows them riding too far forward on the horse, as if they might need to hug the horse's neck for fear of falling off. But these first cavalrymen are slowly learning by trial and error, and within a century they will give up on these early mistakes and be represented as individuals, riding on their own horses with at least the appearance of what we would recognize as cavalry throughout basically the rest of military history until the modern era replaces them with trucks and tanks. But for now, they are driven with the exact same tactics as chariots, apparently filling the exact same battlefield role. Cavalry would be cheaper logistically, because of course you don't have the chariot being pulled behind you, and potentially faster, since the horses again are carrying less total weight. But there's not yet a tactical case to be made for completely replacing the more prestigious chariot with this newfangled cavalry innovation, which is likely a good reason why the chariot fades so slowly from the battlefield, while so many other military technology changes occur seemingly very quickly. But in the end, this is all tactics and weapons. The soldier himself, whether cavalry, chariotry, or infantry, is fundamentally unlike his weapons, even if our chronicles often treat them as little more than extensions of the king's will. What we all wonder is ultimately why the individual soldier, playing his individual role in the grand host of Assyria, is where he is. And we will never know. Not for this period in history. The time when any light at all will shine upon the lives of any actual soldiers is not until after some significant organizational and cultural shifts occur in the late 700s. But there are some things we can say about motivation. Now, first, remember that we've talked about how important it was for each Assyrian king to be seen as a great warrior and general as part of his legitimacy. This wasn't something unique about kingship, though. This is a function of his masculinity, a vision of masculinity shared with the wider Near East, not just his Assyrian subjects, but his Semitic cousins, and even the varied, strange peoples of the whole of the ancient Near East were all, as far as we can tell, enamored to some extent with warfare, tying a degree of virtue and masculinity to martial prowess. This is evolutionary, if nothing else. The Near East has been a crucible of ceaseless war since the dawn of recorded history, and we have no reason to think it wasn't the same for generations prior as well. Few civilizations throughout human history have been able to de-emphasize military activity without being subsequently outcompeted and extinguished by those who continue to emphasize it. For a young man, or even a woman, child, or old man in ancient Assyria, war was a good thing, and the ability to excel in war was a personal virtue for everyone. We can struggle with this idea nowadays. We in the West have all absorbed the idea that killing is inherently bad to such a degree that many of our modern soldiers suffer severe psychological trauma when returning from war. There was shell shock in pre-modern times in its various forms, but there wasn't nearly as much, though disentangling the moral side from the tremendous ferocity of industrial warfare is quite hard. But we have this in our everyday lives. When my niece and nephew were young, my sister once got very mad at me for telling them which animals the various meats come from. She was afraid I would traumatize them. Now, in that case, it seems that the children were not listening to their crazy uncle, but you can be sure that all Assyrian children knew very well which animals their meats came from. They knew the corpse stink of rotten human bodies just as intimately. Death was bad, dying was fearful, and murder was always outlawed. But killing, in the ancient world, was a task alongside many other ugly tasks that filled up the span of a life. In this way, war wasn't a bad thing that good men did, sometimes for good reasons. Losing a war, that was a bad thing. Dying in a war, that's not really something you wanted to do. Assyria doesn't seem to have had the lust for dying in battle that some other peoples have had. But war itself, it was fine, and winning a war was a good thing. There was no downside to winning, as long as it wasn't the ugly sort of victory that cost far too much in the fighting. You walked away from a successful war better off than you had walked into it, especially with the Assyrian military machine at your back. As to what you destroyed, well, the Assyrians didn't necessarily hate the people that they killed. I mean, sure, sometimes there would be a rivalry or a measure of dehumanization. There might be an element of vengeance in any given battle or campaign. But honestly, the Assyrians battled too many peoples to genuinely hate all of them. And there's no inherent sense of xenophobia in their attitude, given how rapidly most conquered peoples were integrated into the empire. There was, however, no sense in the ancient world that other cultures would benefit the Assyrians. Other cultures just did their own thing. Most cultures weren't as civilized as Assyria, but even those that practiced civilization for the benefit of their own people. And there wasn't really a sense that there would be any real spillover of benefits across national boundaries. This is, for a modern comparison, Americans look at the destruction of the world wars with sadness for a lot of reasons, including those moral reasons discussed earlier. We've decided that killing is usually a bad thing. But also, we nowadays have a recognition that the world is poorer for 2 generations of lives lost in those wars, among whose number there must surely have been more great artists, scientists, and engineers and so forth who would have gone on to enrich the wider world, and among whom were certainly many more ordinary folk who would have founded ordinary families which, in their own small way, would have participated in the wider civilization. But for the Assyrians invading Nairi lands, or Zamuan lands, or Habhu lands, or Aramaean lands, there's no sense of anything of note being lost. They simply lack the historical and cultural awareness of what those other peoples could potentially have produced for the greater mass of humanity. History, for the Assyrians, stretched back into the long ages, but among the dead civilizations, there wasn't anything worth plundering, except what raw resources could be recycled. Babylon alone seems to have been an exception here, and as we saw in the Middle Assyrian period, the awareness that the folks they were destroying were part of a great civilization from which the Assyrians benefited, that seems to have really messed up the Assyrians, and it will mess them up again during the next round of Babylonian domination in a few more decades. And all of this adds up to a people capable of going to war year after year against basically anyone they felt like. Ultimately, it allowed the average Assyrian soldier to throw adolescents atop burning pyres while they were still living. It allowed a regular man to take a living captive, impale him on a spike, and leave him there for days at a time until he died. It allowed just any normal person to go into a city and sack it completely, taking captives, committing atrocities, stealing just anything that could be stolen. Now, all of these deeds were dangerous, dirty, and unpleasant, in the way that chopping down a tree on a muddy day is dangerous, dirty, and unpleasant. But it was a thing that sometimes needed to be done, either from a sense of necessity or with an eye on the ultimate rewards. And so next time we're going to get back on the historical path, moving forward through the reign of our psychopath king Ashurnasirpal as he employs this army to tear through yet more enemies to establish this grand edifice of empire. So join us next time for the Great March to the Mediterranean and the possibility that Ashurnasirpal's blood rage was all really just for show. Thank you for listening.